Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm excited to be back with you talking about qualitative data analysis and findings today. Basically, we're looking at what the researchers found out and how they analyzed it. This is chapter 11 from our textbook, Plano Clark and Creswell 2015. Let me see if I have my copy here. Yes. Understanding Research, a Consumer's Guide. And then I've also added, for this lesson, I've added in some examples from some of our faculty here at Augusta University. So I hope you enjoy that. I realized that I hadn't really introduced myself. Dr. Ayana Kikampoli, excited to be here, my first year here at Augusta University. I got my doctorate from Harvard University. Here's my special piece of paper that I got upon graduation. And I spent quite a bit of time at Harvard taking classes on research methods. I love doing research. Also, one of the reasons that I'm really into education research is that I have a 3-year-old daughter. She just turned 3 last week. Her name is Eliana. And I know that the stronger education research we have, the more teachers and school leaders are able to use it, the better her education will be. Okay, so today, qualitative data analysis and findings. Let's go to the next slide. So first we'll talk about data analysis. So characteristics of qualitative data analysis. Systematic, right? So that's the difference between doing research and not doing research, is the systematic way that we're answering our questions. Inductive or bottom up, right? So we're going to start with the details of the data, the details in the raw data, and work ourselves up to codes, and then finally at the highest level of analysis we usually have themes. Interpretive, right? So we talked about this positivist versus interpretivist epistemological differences early on. And so interpretive, we're making personal assessments throughout the process to determine a description that fits the situation or themes that capture the major categories. We are the instrument, we're interpreting the data. Dynamic. Usually when you're doing qualitative research, it's you're doing different things simultaneously. You're moving iteratively through a research process, that kind of thing. Okay, and when you're analyzing, you're cycling back and forth between the actual data and your interpretations of it or your analysis of it. To ensure that you develop the best possible understanding of what your data is telling you. So, steps for qualitative analysis. Step 1, you got to prepare the data. Often in its raw form, it's like hard to work with. Step 2 is exploring the data. Usually this involves reading through what you've collected. Step 3 is coding the data, and that's one of the most important steps. That's the initial phase of analysis where you're doing your first level of interpretation. Step 4, you're developing descriptions and themes. This is the next level of interpretation, and it can be multi-layered. And then step 5, let me see something. Hold on. The babysitter just took my child home from a new school that she just started today, and looks like everything went great. Okay, all right. And then step 5, you're validating the findings. We're using the term validate, but really in qualitative research, remember we're talking about trustworthiness, okay? We're seeing if we're trying to make sure our findings are trustworthy. Okay, so now these steps are similar across different qualitative genres. But there are a few differences, but in general, they're similar. Okay, so first example. Example is from Dr. Kuo, who is one of the researchers and professors in our teaching and leading department. And she wrote a paper recently called Promoting Family Literacy Through the 5 Pillars of Family and Community Engagement. This was published in the School Community Journal in 2016. So let's see what her paper was about. So here's the abstract. And she writes, family literacy involves factors beyond what is done at home between parents and children. To help pre-service teachers develop their understanding of multiple dimensions of family literacy, this study uses the 5 pillars of family and community engagement: early literacy, family involvement, access to books, expanded learning, and mentoring partnerships, to examine how these 5 elements influence pre-service teachers' knowledge of and practices in family literacy. So we know that her topic is family literacy. And can you tell from that part who her participants are? Her participants are actually pre-service teachers, okay? You might think her participants are families, parents, and children, but the focus is on pre-service teachers' understandings. So that's who her participants are. And she continues, while each of the 5 pillars of FACE is critical to the needs of family literacy development and is well described in the literature, there's limited research on the impact of the 5 pillars of FACE on pre-service teachers' knowledge of and practices in family literacy. And pre-service teachers just refers to teachers who are not yet practicing teachers but are training to become teachers. Thus, grounded theory methodology, which you now know what it is, right, was incorporated in the present study to investigate the actualities in the classroom. So we know the genre she's using is grounded theory. After completing 20 sessions of in-class activities and 30 hours of field work, the results indicate that the use of the 5 pillars of FACE not only increased the participants' knowledge of the multiple dimensions of family literacy, but also positively influenced their practices in field work. And so field work is that student teaching they're doing. And that last sentence gives us a hint of her results. It increased their knowledge and it influenced their practice. It influenced how well they were able to teach. Okay. So her method for data collection, I want to show you this first. So you have a framework for understanding what she's analyzing. The students in her class turned in a 1-page reflection paper. Okay, so they wrote about what they were experiencing in their field work or practice teaching. And then they also each did a personal project, and these varied. They could be an art project, a book review, an interview, a research project. They could be about a practitioner article, a literature review, some kind of video, that kind of thing. So they each chose what their personal project was going to be for the course. And then finally, at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, Dr. Kuo gave them a survey. Now, this was a qualitative survey, and the way you know was that it was very open-ended, okay? And so to get their perspectives towards the use of these 5 pillars of FACE in their family literacy course. So the survey had 1 question, and then we presume a lot of space for the participant to write in their answer. And the question was, how do the 5 pillars of FACE help you understand family literacy? Okay, open-ended. How do, you can think of a variety of different ways that a person might answer that question. So this was this was a qualitative survey again, because the students could respond. They're not like choosing was the 5 pillars of FACE very helpful, somewhat helpful, neither helpful nor unhelpful, somewhat unhelpful, or very unhelpful. No, it wasn't where they were using, that's a Likert scale, right? Wasn't where they're using any kind of scale to translate something that was going to be translated into a number. They're actually going to be writing text to answer this survey question. All right, so how do you prepare qualitative data for analysis? Remember, preparing the data is that first step. You create digital copies, for example, such as scanning a document. Now, if Dr. Kuo was in her last class and this was a face-to-face class and she passed out a sheet of paper and she had students write in their answer to that survey question, then she might be scanning in what they wrote. Because nowadays most of our analysis work is done on the computer. If you have audio recordings or field notes, the audio recordings need to be transcribed, right? Again, we're going from something that's verbal into text. Usually it's done verbatim, and it can be at a varying level of specificity depending on what the researcher is looking at. Also, your field notes, if they were jotted down in a notebook or on a piece of tape or napkins or whatever you were writing on, they need to be typed in, right? And then you'd prepare summaries of when you don't have like an interview that was recorded or resources for transcriptions are limited, you might prepare a summary of an interview. That's not ideal, but it can work too. And also sometimes researchers will summarize things that are difficult to capture. Like maybe you have a photograph of a scene, and you'll maybe just write a summary, a description of that kind of thing. Things that you want to make into words, because that's how we usually communicate our research, right? Through these research articles. And then you might organize a database to facilitate the analysis process. So that way you can keep track of where each data source came from and how it might how things might relate to one another, that kind of thing. And so when you think about how might Dr. Kuo have prepared her data, you see she had these fieldwork reflection papers, which if they were actually physically handed in, then she would need to scan them in, and hopefully with OCR software, she would be able to, get them as text rather than as pictures. These personal projects, maybe because they varied so much, maybe she would prepare a summary of each one. The survey questionnaire, again, scanned in. If it was handwritten, then it needs to be typed, or a computer needs to read it as text, editable text. A lot of this is helped using technology. So if I was teaching this class, their fieldwork reflections, I would have them do it in our learning management system. We use D2L here. And I would send them an email with the survey question and they could just email it back to me, or actually do a survey through SurveyMonkey or something where they are doing the typing, because it can take a really long time to prepare your data if you have to type everything in. Okay. So that's the first step, preparing your qualitative data for analysis. So here's her method for how she analyzed the data. She was working with 2 graduate research assistants, And you'll find that collaboration and qualitative research is very important. Okay, so we have Dr. Kuo and 2 graduate research assistants. And the first thing they do was they tried to get a sense of the entire data by reading through all of it. And this slide, I actually took this from her journal article and I just, simplified it a bit so that you could see the steps very clearly. And so that's the exploration part, right? So the steps, we prepare and then we explore. So they're reading, all 3 of them are reading through all of the data. That's how they're exploring it. Okay, so the next step is coding. How did they do that? Okay, so second, they picked one of the most in-depth responses to each data source in order to brainstorm possible ways of coding. So this is a good way of, particularly when you're working with a group of people, of just getting started in terms of coming to an understanding of how you're going to code. You pick the response, like maybe the fieldwork reflection where a student wrote a whole lot, a participant wrote a whole lot, and then that you and your co-researchers go through and say, okay, how are we gonna label this part? Okay, how are we gonna label this next part? Okay, yeah, how we're gonna, and that way you come to an understanding. Then they began to code. So that was preparing to code. Then they began to code the qualitative data. Often, each researcher will have a chunk of data to code or a certain number of participants that they're responsible for coding the data for. And then after coding all the responses and making a long list of all code words, they began to reduce the list of codes by clustering them into themes. So often you might have where you have code words that may be synonyms. So you have parent involvement and parent engagement and parent attendance, and that these things that you've written as you've labeled what each part of your transcript or your survey response was referring to. And so you end up with this long list of code words, and the first level of reduction could be to cluster them together, the things that sound alike or that refer to a similar thing, clustering them into, sometimes you cluster them into subcodes and then you label them with themes. And in this case, they went from the code words and directly to themes. Okay, coding disagreements are, wait a second, no, that's probably not true. I think they had subcodes, and you'll see in their results section. They went from the long list of all code words, and then I think there's some subcodes in there, and that was the next step, and then the last step was themes. Okay, coding disagreements among the researcher and the 2 graduate research assistants were resolved through revisiting the data multiple times, discussing and consulting until the agreement was reached, right? So 2 people might code the same thing in different ways, right? And so just reading that sentence, I know that at least a couple of people were reading each piece of data, each data source. So let's say there was a particular survey from a participant, right? At least 2 people must have coded it, because then they were figuring out, okay, they were talking about where their differences were. And this is another very important part, okay? Remember, we're trying to get at the essence of an experience with phenomenological research, for example. And so we want to have come to a shared understanding with our co-researchers about what each phrase or sentence or paragraph that we're reading in our data, what it means, how we would label it. Okay, lastly, each participant, as well as any student they mentioned by name in their writing, was assigned a pseudonym, and that's for confidentiality of the participants, which were in this case pre-service teachers, and the families and students that they were working with. All right. So, how you explore, right? We talked about this. You read the transcripts and field notes through several times, and they read through their data sources several times. Becoming familiar, forming some initial ideas. You might do a process called memoing, where you're making a record of your thoughts and ideas about your data. And the nice thing about memoing is that it's kind of like it's like your interpretations. You're getting your interpretations down in writing, because as you're reading through, you're going to have thoughts about what you're reading. You're going to have opinions. You're going to start to draw connections, that kind of thing, about what you're reading. And so it's good to get them down, because that makes the process a little easier later as you're doing your analysis, continuing with your analysis. And then organizing the data and considering whether more data are needed. Sometimes you read through all your data and you realize, oh man, I don't have anything about X. Oh, geez, I need to go back and talk to some folks about X, because X is going to be important, but I don't have any data about it. That kind of thing. And then coding. So codes are labels used to describe the meaning of a segment of text. Like I said, usually it's a phrase, a sentence, possibly a few sentences. And they represent the initial interpretations. You can go one of two ways. You can start with, let's say there are certain things you're interested in, and that's what you're looking for in your data. Or you can start with, oh, okay, this seems like a chunk of information. What label would I get? What label would I give it? If you give it participants' actual words, that would be called in vivo codes. But sometimes you are using existing codes. Maybe you're doing research that is part of a series of studies, and you already have a sense of what you're looking for and how you're going to categorize the data. Okay. So managing the coding process. The traditional way was by hand, right? And this is what a friend of mine calls the kitchen table method. And so you would literally print out your data, your transcripts. In this case, she would have printed out, had print out literally physical pieces of paper that were for the student surveys and the students' reflections and the student projects, right? And then you highlight the segments of text. You use a lot of highlighters. When I first did my first analysis, I used a lot of highlighters and a lot of Post-its because I was highlighting to segment the text. And then I was using Post-its to code, label each segment with a code. Some people cut out like the segments. Okay, this part is about, you code it a certain way, and then you can put all your segments together in a pile or something like that. You could paste it onto a card or onto a piece of paper, depending on how many segments that you end up with you've labeled with a certain code. Now, most of the time nowadays, folks are not doing the kitchen table method. Some people still do it, and it does have, certain people, some people like to feel the data and have it like actually something they can hold on to. But a lot of this is done electronically. And so a couple of popular things that are used here at Augusta University are like MaxQDA is a computer program used for processing qualitative data. So is Deduce. I used Atlas TI. In vivo is also a very popular one. And basically you're electronically assigning codes or labels. So everything, you have the text, right? You have the survey, you have whatever you scanned in, you have your field notes. They're now typed up. Everything is text. And you're going through and electronically labeling the text with codes. And it really makes it easier to search for things, and the program will create, pull all the segments that relate to a particular code, and you can organize it. It just makes things faster than the cutting and the gluing and the things that we used to do all the time. Okay. So themes. What are themes? So they're also called categories. And so basically, usually you have these short bits of text that are coded, and then you group them together, the ones that have the same codes. And then you may have several groups. Let's say you have, in this study, they had a group related to what parents said. Okay, that parent involvement. And then another group related to what students said, or student perceptions, and another group related to difficulties with literacy. So you have these codes, right? This coded data, right? And then you start looking for larger patterns. And you might have a step where you're looking, okay, let's bring some of these together because they seem to relate to the same thing. And then you might have another step where you end up with your themes. And remember, in the abstract, she ended up with 5 themes. Okay, you're trying to get the major ideas about this central phenomenon. You're trying to get the essence. What are the main things? What are the main things I can take away from this study? All right, the larger patterns of the data that have emerged from the analysis. In order to develop your themes, you're refining the codes, you're building your findings. It's also called analytic induction, not deduction. Induction, constant comparison, or thematic development. You might see those terms in articles. You may develop descriptions of what each theme means, and in some papers you'll see they relate the themes to one another. And you can see, because remember, one of the questions you might be answering with qualitative research is how, right? And how usually implies a process. And so there may be themes that relate to one another that give insight into a process. Okay. Slide 15. You're reducing the number of codes to about 20 maybe by combining redundant ideas, and then you may reduce it further to sub-themes where maybe you have, I don't know, 10 sub-themes, and maybe that you merge them and you end up with 5 themes, 5 to 7 themes, okay? And then relating the themes, sometimes the major themes and sub-themes are pretty clear, right? Sometimes things are connected, like there's a larger order, whether it's a chronology or a sequence of relationships or a pathway. And then you might develop a visual model to depict these connections. I love it when papers end up with a visual model and you can really get a sense of the whole big picture of what the researchers found out. Okay, so let's look at some results from Dr. Kuo's article on early literacy. Okay, so the first theme was early literacy, and a couple of her sub-themes were children with special needs and instructional methods, okay? And so you can imagine that one of her codes had to do with children with special needs, right? And another code had to do with instruction. And then clustering them together, she found that for children with special needs, she found that the participants noticed that some of the children at the literacy center seemed to have special needs such as autism, attention deficits, or language disorders. And then she gives an example from the raw data, right? She says participant Ada, and Ada would be a pseudonym, right? Stated student C was a young man who worked on the 5th grade level. I believe the student had some type of special needs. Although the young man had no trouble reading each word, it was challenging to understand him. Oh, and I should tell you that these these all the participants were they're working in an after-school program, so it was supplementary education for these students. It was a tutoring program. And I'm going to put the articles that we use as examples in our D2L folder. So if you find it interesting, you want to go back and read the entire article, it'll be there. Okay, and then so you notice you have raw data, you have a summary, and you have a sub-theme. Okay, all right there. And then, like similarly for instructional methods, she writes, to meet the needs of the students, and remember, she's interpreting, right? To meet the needs of the students, the pre-service teachers began by discovering the children's strengths and weaknesses, and then incorporated evidence-based practices to help them develop literacy skills. This excerpt from Sarah's paper illustrates how she worked with the children at the Literacy Center. And then we have an excerpt from Sarah's, probably her fieldwork reflection journal, right? The students were drawing upon prior knowledge when I asked them questions about the story, describing experiences that related to the text. Furthermore, we delved into some of the 5 components of reading. We manipulated the letters and letter sounds using them in different words. So basically, the pre-service teacher is using what she knows about the students and then using what she's learned in her literacy class, which is something we like to see as professors when our students are actually using what they've learned. Okay. So here's another theme, and just a couple of examples of how she had sub-themes, and then we get a sense of the raw data that supports her interpretation of the sub-themes. Her interpretation of the data and her formulation of the sub-themes and themes. So theme 2 was family involvement. Interaction with parents was one sub-theme. It was not surprising to see how challenging it could be for these novice teacher candidates to initiate a dialogue with parents. Some parents were engaged in the dialogue while some were not. For example, Ada described in her paper, when I began telling her about a child's tutoring session, she must be talking about a parent, right? When I began telling her about the child's tutoring session, the mother quickly interrupted saying, "We have to go, we're late for an appointment." I can imagine saying that to one of my teachers if because we're always running late, me and my daughter. So the Dr. Quo is saying it was challenging for these novice teacher candidates to initiate a dialogue with parents, right? And says that some parents were engaged and some were not. And now remember, these are pre-service teachers, right? As you become more experienced as an educator, you learn things about how to manage parent expectations. If you're always going to want to be reporting to parents, then you let them know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to be talking with you for about 5 to 10 minutes after each session to talk with you about what we covered in the session. Or I'll end when some of the pre-service teachers figured, oh wait, I can end a little bit early, then I have more time to talk to the parents. You know, things like that. And so there are different ways you can interpret this, right? This failure to communicate between the parent and the pre-service teacher. You can say, well, the novice teacher she didn't do something, she didn't, you know, set up an expectation for how the dismissal was going to go. Or you can say the parent wasn't available to engage in dialogue. And so as the researchers, right, we are the ones who interpret. But the nice thing about having actual excerpts of raw data is the researcher, the reader, the person who's reading our research can actually have a different interpretation. The raw data is right there. And I can draw my own conclusions about why that parent may have been saying, okay, gotta go. See ya. All right. And here's another one, differentiated support. Moreover, many participants were aware that differentiated support must be used to meet parents' different needs. Yes, and this is what we hope pre-service teachers will start to realize, right? As Kaylee said in her paper, we as teachers or tutors have to differentiate the way we instruct our students, but we also have to think about the way we approach our students' parents. We have to change our ways of talking to the parents and understand parents, right? And so good, she's, starting to notice that, yeah, we want to be adaptive to the needs of both the kids and their families. Okay, slide 19. Now, validating. So we've talked about, let's go back to our steps. We've talked about preparing the data, exploring the data, coding the data, and developing descriptions and themes. The next thing to talk about is validating, okay, because we really want our work to be trustworthy. So slide 19. How do you validate qualitative findings? You use strategies to ensure the accuracy and credibility of your findings as part of your analysis process, right? So if you've got at least 2 researchers reading each field reflection, and then you're talking about it, okay? You're hoping that there's going to be a certain level of credibility to your codes that you've assigned to your data. Attend to any ideas found in the data that did not seem to fit the list of codes. All right, so often we get these, what in quantitative research we would call outliers, okay? Data that just doesn't seem to fit in with the rest. We want to pay attention to that, okay? And because we do want to, we're trying to get a sense of the spectrum, and often that data that doesn't seem to fit, it can point us towards something new and interesting. And then you also want to attend to any ideas that seem to contradict your conclusions. So discrepant, what they call discrepant data. This can also be very helpful for understanding the phenomenon that you want to investigate, this discrepant data. One of the exciting things about qualitative research is that these differences amongst people, these differences amongst our participants, are actually something that we're interested in, right? In quantitative research, you're looking for the average, right? So, and variability, too much variability, and you have a problem. In qualitative research, we want to understand the spectrum of a particular phenomenon that we're studying. We want to understand the nuances, so to speak. Okay. So some typical validation approaches. First of all, bracketing. Remember, we're the instrument, so we need to set aside as much as we can. It's not possible to do it completely because we're in our own bodies, but we need to attempt to set aside our own views and experiences. And I'm going to show you an example where they do this very well. The second thing is triangulation. You might corroborating evidence about a finding. So it might be that you have a few different data sources that are pointing to the same thing. So for example, there was, information about kids with special needs in their reflection journals. You saw it come up, if you see it come up again in their projects. And then finally, when they're writing their survey, they're writing about kids with special needs, right? So you get this evidence, triangulations, getting evidence from different places. And it might be that you get it from different sources of data within a participant, and you might get it from different participants who are having the similar reflections or similar comments about a particular idea or theme. Okay, member checking. One or more participants, you check in with them to check the accuracy of first of all, you can check the accuracy of your raw data. if particularly with interviews, I've seen, sometimes you might ask your participants to, hey, this is what I wrote down that from the transcript. Does it look right? Did I hear you correctly? You want to know about accuracy. You want to know about completeness. You want to know about appropriateness. You want to know about fairness. Am I representing your views fairly? Okay, can be an important question to ask. And then auditing. And here is where a second researcher will independently code your data. So, or not all of it, usually a sample of it, to see if there's agreement as to the major ideas. Okay, and when you have a co-researcher, you can kind of do this for one another. Also, you can discuss your research process with a knowledgeable colleague to review the data collection and analysis procedures as they unfold, right? And this is called peer review, expert review, critical colleague, critical friend is a phrase that's often used. And it really helps to talk some of these things through with someone else, because they can help you get out of the box of your own thinking and have a different perspective on your data. So let's look at an example where I think the validation was really strong. This is a paper by Gallo, Rausch, Smith, and Wood. So some of you might know Dr. Rausch. She's one of our professors in our school counseling department. And the paper was called School Counselors' Experiences Working with Digital Natives, a Qualitative Study. And this was published in the Professional School Counseling in 2016. So the abstract reads, to better understand school counselors' experiences relating to students' use of social media, the authors conducted a qualitative study utilizing a phenomenological approach with 8 practicing high school counselors. So right away we know who our participants are, right? 8 practicing high school counselors. And we know our topic is students' use of social media. 3 major themes emerged from the study. So now we're getting our results, our findings, right? The digital cultural divide, frustration and fear, and embracing change. This article presents implications for school counseling practice and research. Okay, so let's jump into their data coding and analysis. These were interviews. Okay, that was their main data source. The researchers analyzed the data using inductive analysis. This type of analysis allows a researcher to consistently review transcripts while examining emerging themes. And we're getting a sense of the rigor, right? The research team chose specifically to analyze the data in this manner in an effort to understand the digital native phenomenon as a whole unit. Okay, each interview was transcribed and member checked prior to the data analysis process. So that's what I was talking about. You transcribe the interview and then you bring it back to your member or your participant and say, is this what you said? And so what 2 analytic steps does the sentence in bold illustrate? Okay. Each interview was transcribed and member checked. 2 analytic steps. Let's see. Transcription is, where's our steps? Transcription is preparing the data. Okay. We're not audio files. We need text. We need to change the audio files into text. And then member checked, validating the findings, okay? Or you're doing a validation procedures. It's not findings, you're validating your raw data in that case. Okay, slide 24. So, to understand this, you have to know the first team member who was like the lead researcher. She conducted all the interviews. And then the data analysis process consisted of several steps. The second and third research team member reviewed and then coded all the interviews, right? So reviewed, that's exploring, right? And then they coded. Discussion concerning coding continued until agreement for all codes was reached. That's similar to the other paper, right? The finalized codes were organized into categories and then into themes. So we have codes. On top of codes, we formulate categories, and based on the categories, we determine what our themes are. The transcripts, coding, categories, and themes were then reviewed by the first author for internal homogeneity and external heterogeneity. So, is there consistency internally to a participant? Like, is there consistency in terms of what we're interpreting about a particular participant's experiences? And then, is there diversity or divergence across our participants? Okay, we want that diversity. We want that variability, right? With qualitative research. This process involved reviewing the categories for meaning and differences of categories and themes. Okay, we want the categories and themes to be distinguished from one another. Once the research team reached consensus, the team selected quotations from the transcripts that best represented the emergent themes, right? These are in vivo labels for the themes, and thus the phenomenon as a whole. Okay? So, they actually had a section in their paper that was titled Trustworthiness that came right after the section titled, Data Coding and Analysis. And this is I copied, but this is I deleted some things just to make it clearer for you all. So, and trustworthiness again is the qualitative equivalent of validity, okay? Validity and reliability. And so this is the validation that I was mentioning, and I think this is a really good example of how to validate or enhance the trustworthiness of your data and your conclusions. So they employed several strategies. That member checking that we talked about within 1 week of each, that occurred within 1 week of each interview. Second, they use the participant's own words, okay? You know you're on the right track when you can use the participant's own words. When you can't, then there may be something wrong with your interpretations. The third strategy involved researchers bracketing their assumptions and biases before beginning the study. And so what they did was they each wrote about what they thought about the topic before they began, right? So then each of the researchers knew what the other researchers were thinking about and assuming as they entered into this research process, right? And then they would talk with one another, peer debriefing throughout this investigation to minimize bias. For example, if one person is always interpreting something a certain way, hey, you're looking at this from XYZ perspective again, could it be something else? And they can kind of check each other in that way. So for example, in the paper, it tells us that the first author was a doctoral student and a practicing school counselor at a high school in the Midwest. Her assumptions before beginning this study included QRST, right? And so, and then the second researcher believed that all adolescents will UVW, right? And the third researcher believed that her views were affected by her experiences as a YZ. So we know kind of what these people's backgrounds are, where they're coming from, what their assumptions are. And we can kind of be on the lookout. Do we think that this work is being biased by these. The fact that they articulated them reduces the chance that it's going to bias the results, right? Because when you get it out there, oh, this is my perspective, this is where I'm coming from, you know, something that happened with my own, a particular thing happened with my own child, and I'm bringing that, you can think of it as baggage, into a research study. When we get it out there, when we can verbalize it, when we can talk with one another about it, we can more easily separate out what happened to me in my life with versus what is happening in this data that I have collected. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So, findings or results. So you've seen now 2 examples of findings or results. The report of findings usually relates to the research design or genre. So a general qualitative approach is what it's called in your text. It's usually phenomenological. Okay. And that's the report of the themes that emerge from this study. And now a narrative approach would give you a retelling of the participants' stories, right? Including a description of the context and the 3 themes that emerge through the story. In a case study, you would get themes that emerged, but you would also have this in-depth description of the case of what happened in that particular school or in that particular school district or in that particular family or for that particular child, something like that. An ethnographic approach would give you a detailed description about a group, right? Because usually you're looking at a group, a segment of society, and how that group behaves, thinks, or talks, as well as the context and the setting. And a grounded theory approach, you're really, the themes or categories that emerge, and usually you'll have a display of the interconnections among those themes, and a discussion of the theory that emerged. What is the hypotheses? What are the propositions suggested by this theory, these connections that I see between these particular items or these particular themes? Okay, so it looks a little bit different in terms of when you get your report of the findings, but generally they're part of it are themes, right? Thematic findings, like we saw in our 2 examples. And you want the major ideas, right, about your central phenomenon. You want it, but at the same time, you want to be as nuanced as possible. And these are usually the major headings within the findings sections are the themes. And there may be sub-themes like we saw in our examples, and the really interesting papers will have multiple perspectives and contrary evidence, and having participant quotes is always very useful to have the raw data. And there may be literary devices like metaphors or analogies that can really help you kind of get a picture of what each theme is about. And then descriptive findings, slide 29. These are key results that provide information about the context for the study, okay? And you can better understand the phenomenon by understanding the context in which it is embedded. I've seen some like really awesome descriptions of a school where you feel like you're walking down the hall yourself, right? Because the description is so rich. And usually the author has picked out the details that might be, that relate to their themes as a whole. And if you, as the reader, see that certain details in the descriptions are relevant to your own context, then it helps with the identifiability that you have with the research and perhaps with their conclusions as well. So here are some findings from our digital natives paper, Dr. Rausch's digital natives paper. So one major theme was the digital cultural divide, and a sub-theme was this utilitarian use of technology. So who do you think uses it in a utilitarian way? The counselors or the high school students? If you said counselors, you're right. So although school counselors articulated utilizing technology from a practical utilitarian standpoint, they saw that their students engaged with digital technology in a very different way. Students' interactions with technology is very much a fundamental part of their world. As one participant stated, it's almost woven into their lives to such an extent that it's almost the question is, what isn't a part of social media, right? So those of us of a certain generation, we log into Facebook occasionally to catch up on the latest, births and birthdays and that kind of thing. But for these young people, it's woven into the fabric of their lives. And we get that very clearly from the quote, and the interpretation goes along with the quote. So here's another theme. One of the sub-themes was TMI, too much information. And basically what the counselors were talking about was the fact that these high school students are putting, posting on Facebook, right? And they're not like editing enough from the school counselor's point of view. So as participant 8 said, nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. And so if people make mistakes on something, it's being put back in their face, right? And we're trying to make it better, and they're trying to do things the right way next time. They're still having something that happened a year ago thrown back in their face when things didn't go their way. So something didn't go a high school student's way, and they mouth off about it, and it comes back to haunt them later. And this was, gave, the school counselor some angst. And so then the next few slides are about how you evaluate data analysis and findings. And this is from your text. So you're going to be seeing some very similar things to some of the other kind of charts that we looked at that were similar. Overall, the findings are my favorite part often of the study, right? That's when I read the abstract and then I flip to the findings to find out, what did they find out? And so I hope that you also enjoy reading research articles and learning from them what various researchers have found out. Okay, have a good day, everyone.